Thank you very much. First of all, I want to thank Gaetano for the extreme honor of allowing me to be the last speaker today. Always a favorite position. I have a couple of thank yous to make. I want to thank Luciana and Kim for doing a great job of demonstrating the power of VR, and that will allow me to go through a whole bunch of slides quite quickly. I want to thank my students at UBC Law, who over the last 2 weeks heard me lecture on this subject for a total of 5 hours, which I'm now going to compress into 20 minutes. I guess I just want to say, to counter any expectations, that I'm really dealing with a narrow point. I'm dealing with the narrow point of what happens if, and it's a very big if, the power of this technology is used against you. What should the law be thinking about now? Because law is notoriously slow in catching up with technology. I happen to think there are good reasons for that, but that's a different lecture. And if we don't start thinking about these issues now, we end up maybe a little behind the times. So I'm going to focus on, even Kim and Luciana were really talking about virtual reality 1.0, where we are now, and even there you saw the power. I'm going to be focusing you, or trying to focus you on 3.0, coming at some point in the future. So even in 1.0, we know it's hard to tell the difference between what's real and what's virtual. It will be nearly impossible. This is a wonderful experiment that came out about a couple of weeks ago. It was published. It's very simple, and there's a turtle, and there's some gear, and it's completely non-invasive. And what it allows you to do is to control the turtle's actions. And no one is even getting into the brain of the turtle. What we know about turtles is that they go towards light. So your controller allows you to create a dark light field around them so that they will go wherever you steer them, because you're going to leave a little bit of light at a certain place and it'll be dark the rest of the place. So think of that as a metaphor for what the power of VR can do. And this is, as I said, completely non-invasive if you consider having all this gear on your turtle shell non-invasive. Where this gets problematic is advertising. This was out of a conference here about 2 weeks ago from a big ad agency guy who said essentially that VR and its new reality represents an entirely new way to think about advertising. How exciting. You know where this is going. And a wonderful paper called The Algorithmic Self by Frank Pasquale that I couldn't recommend more highly. There is a delicate balance between appropriating new technologies and being appropriated by them. So, and the last piece of this introduction is the nightmare scenario. If someone secretly controlled what you say, would anyone notice? And would you even know about it? So I'm going to very quickly go through these categories. And the two problem areas around info gathering and affecting behaviors have been well covered, so I'm going to go through them particularly quickly. And I'm going to give everybody false comfort by setting my timer. And then I'm going to try and show you at least some ideas on why humans are particularly susceptible to VR. There's a reason why this is happening. I'll give you some conjectures on that. And then take a deep breath. I'm going to venture into post-structuralism. If you don't know what that is, I'm not going to go very far into it. I'm just going to give you a couple of quick conclusions, which you'll have to trust me on. Nobody believes post-structuralists anyway, so don't worry about it. And then I'm going to try and spend as much time on the law and the really important question of when should law intervene. And I am not an early interventionist. I'm a freedom of expression lawyer by trade, so I want intervention late and only when necessary. But I do think, based on what our two speakers have said, if we don't start thinking about this now, we don't want to be in a position where the industry is reactive to, and government, more importantly, becomes reactive because some tragedy has occurred. So let's start thinking about it. So in terms of gathering information, just remember there is no one-way tube. If we're getting information in, information can be obtained from us. And all our devices increasingly are reading who we are, and game companies already have a ton of information about us and are getting more. Now, what do these sensors do? I'm just going to let you do this as a bit of a Rorschach test. Detect your emotions. Know if you're depressed. Know if you're going to buy something. I think that's interesting to the ad guy that we talked about before. And perhaps this will be under your skin or in your brain at some point. So we're getting to that scary place, and thanks to Elon Musk, this is a trigger warning, we now have this notion as of a couple of weeks ago. He's going to set up a company that will link brains and computers, the neural lace. I'm sure there'll be no advertising involved. Second part of the problem, affecting your behavior. And we call this brain games. So what can be done to you? And what can be done particularly because of the amplifying knowledge of you that is in big data, that we already know is in big data. So there'll be no escaping our ads in VR. This was Yahoo's plan to completely immerse you in, and immerse themselves in knowledge of you. This I find benign and positive, but this was Netflix deciding what shows they're going to commission based on information, very specific information about you and their demographic and what they like to watch on a granular basis. We know about the problems of addiction, and we know, thanks to the US election and perhaps other elections, how this can affect politics potentially. And we know about the mirror effect of information. So suddenly, guess what? You're the turtle. We know about the weaknesses and strengths of algorithms and how they can be manipulated, and sometimes manipulated against the people who are even programming them. They're not aware of their own prejudices, and they get reflected back. So we are, and I don't think this is a bad thing, but we are the next platform. Gets a little scarier. We've achieved, this is all legit science, legit universities, brain-to-brain interfaces, animal mind melds, and this is my favorite, well worth watching this nature video, how to see someone else's dreams. There's a real explanation, it's not gobbledygook. But we can see other people's dreams, and you have to watch it. Now we get to the super dangerous. Neuroscientists plant false memories in the brain. We have hackers. Will we have brain hackers? So the problem is, are we going to lose our human agency, our humanity in this? There are great positives in empathy and other things, and I'm going to talk about those a little bit. But I want to go a little bit further and just speculate on why we are particularly susceptible to VR. because it does seem like we are. This is a picture of Kim and my colleague from the Center for Digital Media in Vancouver, Patrick Pennefather, and his fake dog also wearing VR glasses. So one reason we're susceptible is, if you follow Yuval Harari, we are, interestingly, the only animals that believe in things that only exist in our imagination. Religion, nation states, money. Dogs don't believe in those things. They're a little bit more literal. Are we in a simulation? Nick Bostrom did a nice piece at Oxford, but what really made news was when tech billionaires believe that we are already in a simulation. I think the statistical figure that Bostrom comes to is around 2/3 chance, 66% chance that we are in a simulation. I tell my students it doesn't obviate the necessity for them to get their papers in. Here's a weird one, which I think is probably my favorite point around this. Is this a video game? The process of creating a model of the world using multiple feedback loops and various parameters in order to accomplish a goal. Certainly sounds very, to those of you who play games, it resonates in a very real way. It's actually the definition of consciousness, according to Michio Kaku. Consciousness is the process of creating a model of the world using multiple feedback loops and various parameters in order to accomplish a goal. So at the very least, I think we can say that how we are conscious and how we play games is aligned. So maybe that's one reason VR is so powerful. And this is AR, of course, but sometimes it's too aligned. These are all the accidents that happened as a result of Pokemon Go and people being completely distracted. So hopefully I've made a case for our vulnerability. And vulnerability, those of you who are lawyers will recognize, is not an insignificant term in the law. So please breathe. If you're a philosophy major, or more importantly, if you're not a philosophy major, I'm just going to quickly go through this. And I'm sort of a fancier Jacques Derrida, which may be a bad choice. But basically, you have to think of things as structural and post-structural. And post-structural things are where the author is important, but not necessarily as important as the decentralized reader. So when you're in an environment, your interpretation is as valid or more valid than the author's. And that's very simple and crude and probably incorrect definition of post-structuralism. But the point is that it represents human agency, choice, and creativity. Structuralism doesn't. If things are too structured, they tend to move against human agency, choice, and creativity. And this has been downgraded, and originally it was 3 question marks, and because of some reading I've done in the last week where people agreed with what I thought I was saying, I've moved it down to only 1 question mark. But it's worth, and they were actually citing post-structuralists, and so I felt comforted by that, and they were social commentators. But this is kind of a very crude version. I don't know that anyone else has written it, but I put it to you that there's an inverse relationship between creative freedoms. I don't mean democratic freedoms, and I certainly don't mean our well-being in terms of health or eating or safety, but just creative freedoms and human agency in that limited context, that there's an inverse relationship to technology. And so this is just a quick history of technology from the first stone tools to the internet. And 1958, that's what I classify as the first video game. There's some discussion about that. Technology is very structuralist. For all the great things and the great freedoms that VR allows, there are a lot of ones and zeros. There are, as Kim very, very ably showed, a whole lot of design choices and tricks and very, very structured things. And you may say, oh, wow, there's choice. But there's choice, and then there's depth, and then there's the illusion of choice. I don't know how many people here are parents, and if you're not, really? I have, all right. I think of, okay. Let me just put it to you this way. As a parent, if your kid doesn't want to go to sleep, you say to them, do you want a hot chocolate, or do you want a story before you go to sleep? The non-negotiable part is you are going to sleep. So it's the illusion of choice. So overall, I would say we lose personal agency in the virtual world and not gain it. Virtual reality is structuralist, maybe not for always. As technology evolves, it may give us more genuine choices. So, is it drawing too long a bow to suggest that the law should intervene when we substantially lose our human agency? But what about, Luciana very well talked about, compassion and the uses for compassion. And these are very valuable and important things. Compassion, I would suggest, comes from the immersion, not from the choice. In fact, you don't have the choice to be compassionate because you are becoming the person, the tree that's being chopped down. And so it isn't human agency, it's the degree of the power of the immersion. So quickly, the law. This is not a problem we haven't seen before, subliminal advertising. And we dealt with it. It's in all the industry codes around advertising. We have privacy law. Now, is it robust enough to deal with these issues? You know, when you look at reasonable expectation of privacy and that concept, it fits pretty well. But there may be other ways. This morning, we heard about where the European Commission thinks around VR, and indeed, they do put it in the, hey, maybe this is a drug. And certainly, there's a real risk to the industry that this may get looked at as a drug, and I know from your experience with the Psychoactive Substances Act and the politics around that, looking at something as a drug may not be the most desirable result in the UK. Here is the EC position. You can check it out when we post the slides. Should we regulate? Luciana raised that point, and there's certainly a temptation to do that, and there's a wonderful paper by Ryan Calo of the University of Washington Law School called Digital Market Manipulation about this stuff, where he calls for regulation in the area. Can we look at you not, my information not being used against me in terms of contractual good faith and honest performance, because most of this stuff is going to come up in a contractual context. Maybe the platform is a trustee of your data by an implied term of the contract, because you are going to have a contract. And I love the British test that also applies in Canada, the officious bystander. if the officious bystander would say, oh, you better put in a clause that says the data won't be used against the subject, both the subject and the contractor would say, oh no, of course it's there. So it is possible, but not guaranteed, that a court would imply protections. This is a short paper by Jonathan Zittrain of Harvard and Jack Balkin of Yale that introduces the concept of information fiduciaries. It was in the Atlantic magazine a couple of months ago. It's well worth reading, and I want you just to focus on the words. Because the question I want to put to you is whether constructive trust might be really useful here. Could a court determine that a platform is a constructive trustee of your sensitive data with commensurate fiduciary responsibilities towards you? Think about that. I think that's a real possibility. It seems to fit. I'll show you one area that's a problem. But the definition seems right, where they're holding legal property that they should not possess or use against you. Come back to the property word in a minute. It requires a relationship of dependency and reliance, just as Trump has on Putin. So, that's all right. So the objection to that is trust must be of property. And I'm just going to go through these slides because almost all of you as intellectual property lawyers believe strongly, I would suggest too strongly from some of my other work, in the notion of property. And property being associated with data and information and content and creativity. Certainly, US privacy rights are very close to being defined in a property sense. Personality rights, which are at play here, can be thought of as property. And I think you got to bring in freedom of thought as an interpretive aid. We have it in our Charter of Rights. It's in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Freedom of thought, security of the person. If you use those things as interpretive aids, I think you get to a place of saying it shouldn't be too hard to say there needs to be a right to be forgotten for your brain data, for your personal brain data. It can't just be floating out there or mixed in with the other stuff that Facebook or YouTube or Google has about you. One last question, and then I'm done. When do we lose our human agency? I've not answered that question. You could use the automatism test. That's a criminal law defense test. It's very imperfect as it is. It may not be the best standard. It's certainly not my preferred standard. So I formulated one. This morning, people were talking about industry associations, maybe trying to figure out what the rules of the road should be. So, for what it's worth, I'm suggesting that the law should intervene where data was obtained from an individual without informed consent, and that individual's freedom of thought is impacted, causing a substantial risk of harm. So I can back that up, but I don't have the time through the literature. In that context, somebody's going to say, well, what's freedom of thought? Freedom of thought to be defined in terms of personal autonomy and human dignity, not just to make choices, but to make creative choices on one's own terms, creating one's own meanings. Back to being a post-structuralist. So this is all a matter of perspective. I hope I've been close to time. I thank you for your attention.